there's a kind of different relationship of China's creditor position to the creditor positions of America and Europe towards other countries. First of all, the United States can never repay its government debt. It is said America's government debt is not to be repaid because if we repaid it, there wouldn't be any more money. The dollar bills that Americans have in their pocket, that's technically a government debt. And if the government would pay it off, all it could do is say, okay, in exchange for your $20 bill, we're giving you two $10 bills. Take your pick. So that America has already made itself debt-free in essence. But it's also said we want to hurt China. And the way we can hurt China is taking its foreign exchange reserves. It knows that the United States is saying, China, you're our enemy. So why does China hold dollars? Well, that's because China needs to stabilize its foreign exchange rate. It needs to hold the yuan with some kind of parity with the dollar and European currencies. It doesn't. The question is, how many dollars does it need? It doesn't need so many dollars. China has accumulated trillions of dollars worth of savings in the last few decades. What does it do? Well, partly China is replacing them with gold. Partly China is replacing them with foreign currency, and partly China is spending these dollars to make capital investments in other global South countries to develop the Asian economy, the Eurasian economy around it. It's building Silk Road facilities. Most of these, it's taking an equity position as well as a debt position. Unlike the Americans and Europeans, China doesn't say, if you can't pay the debts from the port facilities we've built, then you're going to have to lower your living standards and essentially become our colony. It's saying if you can't pay, we realize that we're making a long-term investment in Eurasian infrastructure. This investment can't be paid in the short term. But we're looking at the long term. So we're not going to ask you to pay the debts now. Its agreement with its Asian neighbors, Pakistan and other countries, Central Asia, that it's helping finance, can become a model for what these global South countries can negotiate and insist on in their relations with the United States and Europe. So basically, China should use the dollars that it's accumulated to make this spread its capital investment to create local prosperity, realize that it's willing to take the returns later. The problem with the NATO and American financial system is that it lives in the short run. In the short run says, pay us now. We're not going to look at the economic consequences. All we cared about is getting paid. And China should say, what we care about is promoting long-term development. That's our philosophy. The problem is that China would like to spend much of these dollars on importing computer chips, computer chip making machinery, the high technology to make this. But the United States has already said, we're not going to sell you any of this. You're going to have to become independent yourself, and you're going to have to help other Asian neighbors make their own products that you used to import from the United States and Europe, because the world's dividing into two halves. And basically, that by doing that, it will try to minimize the holdings of US dollars to maybe only a few $100 billion that it needs to prevent a currency raid on the yen. Because if there is an attempt by the United States and NATO to have a currency raid to drive down the value of the Chinese currency, Chinese can always impose capital controls. China should provide a model for the whole world as to how to minimize its dollar debt and de-dollarize as much of its economy as possible, while realizing that the dollar is still going to be a major world currency and will still be an element of every country's savings, because it will need to make some trade in dollars with the dollarized area, especially now that the euro is essentially collapsing because of America's war against Europe that began last February with the sanctions to prevent Europe from any further reliance on Russian gas or other raw materials. Well, this is exactly what I was talking about at the beginning of my talk today. There's a difference between good debt and bad debt. China has not engaged in the kind of bad debt that the United States and its European satellites have engaged in. Its debts have been designed not to shrink economies by IMF type austerity programs, but to help economies grow. So the third world debt cancellation should really say we're canceling the debts that were left over in 1990 after the sort of Latin American debt bond. We're wiping out the debts that were made by American banks and bondholders, by the IMF and the World Bank that didn't help us develop, but underdeveloped our economies, maldeveloped our economies, malformed our economies, and were made under a junk economics view that the purpose of these debts was not to help us grow. The purpose was to injure us and make it independent. And make us dependent on American food and American exports and essentially the American investors in taking over our banking and monetary system. That's not what China's tried to do. China did not try to take over their banks and monetary system. China did not take over existing government raw materials, natural resources, and public infrastructure. It used its loans to create new means of productions, new infrastructure, new transportation, new trade. And so the debts that should be canceled are the dollar debts and any sterling and euro debts, because these were predatory debts from the beginning, and that makes them, in effect, odious. These were debts dictated by military victors interfering with independence and sovereignty of the debtor countries in Latin America, Africa, and others. And so when you look at the historical conditions, and I think Eric Toisant is going to explain some of these conditions that have occurred, it's the bad debts are being that were made with bad aims in mind. The aims were not to help countries repay, but that's to make sure that they were unable to repay the debts and therefore had to submit to IMF austerity programs and privatize their public infrastructure. This is the exact opposite of China's socialist philosophy. So by distinguishing finance capitalist imperialism from socialist mutual aid and mutual support, you provide the logic for what debts should be paid and how, and what debts should be written off.